I shot the clerk.
Hey, Dean, we need you out here. I'm in the middle of a damn confession here.
Whoa! Hello, Ma. We've been arrested. Ma, please. Ma, please. First of all, we didn't do it, all right? Murder. Ma, please, Ma, it's a mistake, all right? We must look like the guys who did it. I don't know what it is.
Tell her what we think is happening. What we think is happening.
Shut up.
November 4th, 1961. A calm morning on Long Island, New York. No cameras, no crowd, no spotlight. Only the sound of wind brushing through the trees and the soft cry of a newborn child. A cry that would one day echo across generations. That child was Ralph George Macchio, Jr. When Ralph took his first breath, the world had yet to hear of the Karate Kid, yet to see Daniel LaRusso raise his fists in quiet defiance. But somewhere, in the unseen fabric of fate, a small star was being lit. A star that would one day remind the world that kindness, humility, and discipline can be more powerful than fame itself. Ralph grew up not in luxury, but in the warmth of an ordinary American family. A boy who loved music, tap dancing, and daydreams. No one could have known that those small feet, tapping to the rhythm of childhood, were tracing the first steps toward a lifelong dance with destiny. The world doesn't remember the noise of your arrival, it remembers the silence of your becoming. Hollywood births thousands of stars every year, but only a few manage to shine without being consumed by their own light. Ralph Macchio would become one of them, a man who walked through fame with quiet grace, who chose peace over spectacle, truth over attention, and whose gentleness became his greatest strength. Today, as we honor his birth, we celebrate not only the actor, but the man behind the myth. A soul who never let Hollywood change the rhythm of his heart. A fighter who believed in compassion more than competition. A legend who reminded us that the greatest power is not victory, but kindness. This is not the story of a fighter. It's the story of a man who learned to fight without hate. This is where his story begins. A story of humility in an age of ego, of patience in a world of speed, of a man who turned discipline into art and art into empathy. Ralph Macchio, the boy who became the embodiment of quiet strength.
Every legend begins not in fame, but in the quiet places where dreams first dared to whisper. Long before Hollywood lights ever touched his face, Ralph Macchio was just a boy from Long Island. A child of modest beginnings, born to Ralph Sr. and Rosalie Macchio, a family of Italian-American roots, where warmth, loyalty, and laughter were the language of every day. In that home, dreams were not grand speeches. They were quiet, like the smell of coffee in the morning, or the sound of Sinatra playing softly on the radio. Ralph's father, a hard-working man of discipline and craft, taught him the value of effort, that greatness doesn't come from talent alone, but from how gently you carry it. His mother, Rosalie, was the heart of the home, a woman of grace and patience, who believed that kindness is a form of strength. From them, Ralph inherited the balance between humility and quiet determination. That balance would one day define his entire life. He was never the loudest in the room, but even as a child, he carried something rare, a sense of calm that made others feel seen. At just 3 years old, Ralph discovered tap dance. His feet became instruments of joy. His first stage, a linoleum floor beneath the family's kitchen lights. That rhythm would follow him for life, teaching him timing, patience, and the beauty of control. In that small act, a boy dancing with no audience, the seed of a performer was planted. He didn't dream of Hollywood then. He dreamed of connection, of making people feel something. And that perhaps was his truest gift, He didn't chase attention, he invited emotion. As he grew older, the simplicity of Long Island life began to fade. The world outside was louder, faster, uncertain. But Ralph remained grounded, the quiet observer, the old soul in a young boy's body. He carried himself with a natural authenticity, something casting directors would later describe as real, almost too real. In a time when everyone wanted to act, he was content simply to be. That honesty drew people in. It was what made him different, and what Hollywood in time would crave. But before cameras and fame, before lines and lights, there was a simple truth. Ralph loved stories. He loved how they could make ordinary people extraordinary, how they could turn silence into meaning. Perhaps without realizing it, he was already preparing for the role that one day would define his name, the boy who believed in the power of doing what's right, even when the world doesn't. Long Island was both his home and his classroom. It taught him patience, humility, and the beauty of the everyday. While the city lights of Manhattan glimmered across the bay, Ralph found his own light in small, quiet places. The reflection of the sun on the water, the laughter of family dinners, the rhythm of a dance step repeated until it felt like breathing. Those moments, unremarkable to most, were the foundation of everything he would become. Greatness is not born in spectacle. It grows in the unseen corners of a life well lived. By 16, the boy from Long Island had something rare. Not arrogance, not hunger, but a quiet confidence that seemed to whisper, "I am ready." Soon, a local talent scout noticed him. A chance encounter, a conversation, and just like that, a door opened. The small-town boy stepped forward, not knowing that his next step would lead him straight into the heart of Hollywood. Every journey begins with innocence, but only a few carry that innocence with them into the storm.
Some roles are written on paper. Others are written on the soul. The year was 1979. The small-town boy from Long Island had stepped into a world that didn't yet know his name, but he carried something Hollywood rarely finds: authenticity. A sincerity so untouched that even the cameras seemed to pause and listen. Ralph's first break came with 8 is Enough, a light-hearted television series. It wasn't fame yet, just a beginning. But every scene, every line carried the same quiet conviction that had guided him since childhood. Be honest, not loud. The early 1980s were changing Hollywood. Action heroes dominated screens. Fame was louder, faster, flashier. But in the middle of that noise, a gentle, thoughtful young man was about to redefine what a hero could be. He didn't look like a fighter. He looked like someone you could trust. When director John G. Elvidson began searching for Daniel LaRusso, he wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for truth. Over hundreds of auditions, they saw boys who could act tough, boys who could fight, boys who wanted to be stars. But none of them had what Daniel needed: the soul of a kid who could lose, learn, and rise again with heart. And then, Ralph walked in. Elvidson watched quietly. Producer Jerry Weintraub leaned forward, and in that quiet moment, a decision was made. It wasn't the way Ralph delivered the lines, it was the way he believed them. He didn't play Daniel LaRusso, he was Daniel LaRusso. Pat Morita, who played Mr. Miyagi, once said, "Ralph wasn't acting, he was living the message." The connection between teacher and student extended beyond the screen. Off camera, Ralph looked up to Morita with deep respect, and Morita, in return, treated him like a son. Together, they created something Hollywood rarely achieves, a relationship that wasn't manufactured by the script, but born of mutual humanity. When The Karate Kid premiered in 1984, it wasn't just a film, it was a feeling. Audiences around the world saw themselves in Daniel LaRusso, the outsider, the dreamer, the fighter who wins not by force, but by faith. Ralph's performance transcended acting. He gave the character a beating heart, vulnerable, stubborn, brave, and in doing so, he gave the world a hero they could grow up with. He made courage look human again. It was the moment that changed everything. A single kick that launched a legacy. A film that cost $8 million and earned over $130 million worldwide. But beyond numbers, it created something far more powerful. A symbol of discipline, heart, and forgiveness. And at its center stood Ralph Macchio, the quiet boy from Long Island, who carried a nation's nostalgia without ever losing himself. Fame came quickly. Magazine covers, interviews, screaming fans. Yet Ralph remained the same. He smiled softly, thanked people gently, and went home early. While others chased the Hollywood storm, he walked through it like rain, letting it touch him, but never drown him. He was the calm in an age of chaos, the boy who reminded us that decency never goes out of style. Ralph began exploring other roles. A musician in Crossroads, a young rebel in The Outsiders, a cousin accused of murder in My Cousin Vinny. But even as he changed characters, the soul of Daniel LaRusso remained, a mirror of who he truly was, honest, kind, quietly determined. By the mid-1980s, Ralph Macchio was not just an actor. He was an icon, a cultural compass pointing toward integrity. But behind the applause, there was something he never let the world see, the fear that fame might distort the purity that brought him here. Sometimes the hardest fight is not against another person, but against the image the world wants you to become. For Ralph, success was never about winning. It was about staying true. And as he looked toward the horizon of his career, he felt the faint tremor of what every rising star eventually faces: the weight of expectation and the shadow of the fall.
Every light casts a shadow, and sometimes the brighter it shines, the deeper that shadow becomes. It was 1985. Hollywood had a new golden boy, the face of innocence, the living embodiment of The Karate Kid. At just 23 years old, Ralph Macchio had become a global phenomenon. Magazines called him the eternal boy next door. Teenagers around the world mimicked his stance, his smile, his crane kick. He was a hero, not just on screen, but in the hearts of those who saw themselves in his quiet courage. The sequel arrived in 1986, The Karate Kid Part 2. It was bigger, more emotional, and more personal. Daniel LaRusso had grown, and so had Ralph. But with that growth came pressure. The world no longer saw Ralph the actor. They saw Daniel the ideal. And that ideal was heavy to carry. To millions, he was strength. To himself, he was still searching. Fame, for Ralph, was never intoxicating. It was isolating. He had stepped into a role so powerful that even when the cameras stopped rolling, the world refused to let Daniel LaRusso go. Every interview began with karate. Every headline repeated the same story. Every fan asked the same question: "Can you do the crane kick?" And slowly, the man beneath the icon began to disappear behind the myth. For many, fame feels like arrival. For Ralph, it began to feel like confinement. He wanted to explore, to evolve, but the industry wanted him to stay 18 forever. Hollywood had frozen him in time, a porcelain figure in a museum of nostalgia. Off-screen, Ralph lived the opposite of a Hollywood life. He married young, to Phyllis Fierro, his high school sweetheart. While others chased after fame,
Ralph chose to chase something simpler, a family, a sense of belonging, a normal life. He found in love what fame could never give him: peace. He once said in an interview, "I never wanted to lose the ability to go to the grocery store." It wasn't a rejection of fame. It was a quiet rebellion against losing himself. But Hollywood has a short memory. As new faces appeared, the spotlight began to drift away. The world that once called his name so loudly now turned its gaze elsewhere. And for Ralph, the silence that followed wasn't failure. It was freedom he didn't yet know how to hold. When applause fades, what remains is truth. Every artist faces this moment, when the echo of their own success begins to fade. It's not a fall, but a reckoning. Who are you when the world stops watching? For Ralph Macchio, that question became the quiet turning point of his journey. Behind his calm smile, he was learning that even heroes must face the weight of their own reflection. He continued to act, but the roles were fewer, smaller, quieter. Hollywood no longer needed Daniel LaRusso, or so it thought. Yet Ralph never lost his gentleness. He never grew bitter. He never turned against the industry that forgot him. He waited, not for opportunity, but for peace. Sometimes, the truest form of strength is not in rising fast, but in standing still with grace. At his peak, he had everything: fame, love, legacy. But beneath the surface, he was learning the hardest lesson of all: that the mountaintop is not where one finds truth, it's where one begins to see the valley below and understand that every rise carries within it the seed of transformation. Sometimes the greatest silence follows the loudest applause. When the world stopped saying his name, Ralph Macchio didn't chase it back. He didn't call his agent in desperation, didn't beg for bigger roles, didn't try to reinvent himself in chaos. He simply breathed. After The Karate Kid Part 3, 1989, Hollywood turned its gaze elsewhere. The 1990s arrived with new faces, new tones, new obsessions. The age of action heroes and anti-heroes had begun, and the boy who once stood for innocence no longer fit the story the industry wanted to tell. He continued to act in television, in small films, but the roles were different now. Supporting parts, cameos, moments that flickered and vanished quietly. And yet, there was no bitterness, only stillness. Ralph retreated from the noise of Hollywood, choosing instead the soft hum of suburban life. He became a husband, a father, a man who measured success not in headlines, but in heartbeats shared at home. He didn't lose the spotlight. He simply stepped out of it. In a world obsessed with constant visibility, Ralph found strength in being unseen. He learned that there is dignity in distance, that a flame burns longer when it isn't forced to shine too bright. The fall for him wasn't about failure. It was about reflection. It was about understanding that the story he carried, Daniel's story, wasn't just his legacy. It was his burden, too. Everywhere he went, people still called him the Karate Kid. Decades had passed, but the world refused to let him grow up. And yet, he never resented it. He wore that title like a scar that didn't hurt anymore, just a reminder of a beautiful past. He was no longer the boy who fought to win. He had become the man who learned to let go. For Ralph, family became his grounding force. He often said his wife Phyllis was his home base. They met as teenagers, and through every up and down of fame, she remained the still point in his spinning world. It was in these quiet years that Ralph learned something Hollywood rarely teaches: that a man's worth is not defined by how loud the world applauds, but by how gently he loves when no one is watching. Even away from blockbusters, he never lost his curiosity for the craft. He explored theater, television, and independent film, not for fame, but for the art itself. He was an artist without a stage, and yet he kept creating. For some, the fall is the end. For others, it's the pause before a deeper beginning. In the stillness of these years, Ralph began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: gratitude. He realized that not every actor is meant to live in constant spotlight. Some are meant to remind the world of decency, not dominance, of sincerity, not spectacle. And while Hollywood forgot him for a while, the world never did. Fans grew older, but they remembered Daniel LaRusso the way one remembers a childhood friend, with warmth, with nostalgia, with love. The legend endured quietly. The flame never died, it just waited. And somewhere, in the silence between the past and the present, the story was preparing to return. No one knew it yet, but Ralph's fall wasn't an ending. It was the soil where his rebirth would take root. Because when the world had finally moved on, when the name Karate Kid became nostalgia, a new generation was about to rediscover him, and through him, rediscover themselves. Every quiet chapter holds a secret ending. Every ending is just a doorway waiting for light.
Sometimes destiny waits. It doesn't vanish. It simply pauses until the soul is ready to return. More than 3 decades had passed. The world had changed, faster, noisier, sharper. But some stories never age. They sleep in the hearts of those who grew up believing in them. And then, one day, destiny knocked again, softly, patiently, as if to say, it's time. When YouTube and Netflix approached Ralph Macchio in 2017 with the idea of revisiting The Karate Kid, he hesitated. For years, he had protected that story, not as property, but as something sacred. He feared that a remake might cheapen it, that the legend might be turned into parody. But this wasn't a remake. It was a reflection, a chance to explore not the boy who fought, but the man who grew up afterward. For the first time, Daniel LaRusso would no longer be the student. He would be the teacher. It was a story not about victory, but about legacy, about how the lessons of youth shape the man we become. Daniel LaRusso, once a humble fighter, was now a mentor, a father, a teacher, a man wrestling with his own ideals in a complicated world. Ralph stepped back into the role, not as the same boy, but as the man who had lived enough life to understand him deeply. The magic of Cobra Kai was not nostalgia alone, it was truth. Truth about aging, forgiveness, and redemption. For decades, fans had seen Daniel as the pure hero, and Johnny Lawrence as the villain. But now the show dared to ask, what if both were human? In youth, we fight for victory. In age, we fight for understanding. Ralph's performance carried the same purity he'd always had, but now tempered by time, by loss, by wisdom. He didn't return to prove he still could. He returned to prove that stories, like souls, can grow older without losing their heart. Off camera, their friendship mirrored their characters' evolution. The rivalry of 1984 had matured into respect. Two men, once young actors on opposite sides of a screen, now fathers, husbands, survivors of the same Hollywood tide. They were no longer acting out a fight. They were celebrating survival. The world responded with love. Millions watched Cobra Kai. Generations, both old and new, found themselves moved by its honesty. It wasn't about karate anymore. It was about forgiveness, identity, and the passing of light from one soul to another. Ralph Macchio had not just returned to Hollywood, he had transcended it. He became what Mr. Miyagi always hoped he'd be. Not the best fighter, but the best version of himself. Every scene carried the spirit of his old friend, Pat Morita, the man who taught him not just acting, but balance. Ralph often said he felt Morita's presence while filming, as if the lessons of the teacher had never truly left the student. In Cobra Kai, he honored that legacy, not by imitating, but by listening. Each bow, each moment of silence, each whisper of wax on, wax off, was not nostalgia, it was a prayer. For Ralph, this was not just a return to fame, it was a return to faith. Faith in storytelling, faith in simplicity, faith in the belief that kindness still has a place in the world. He came back not to reclaim the past, but to prove that the past still matters. The light had returned, but this time it was softer, less about glory, more about grace. And Ralph stood in that glow not as the boy who kicked, but as the man who endured. It's rare in Hollywood, a story that completes its circle, a man who walks away from fame only to return when the world is ready to listen again. Ralph Macchio didn't chase the light. He waited for it to find him, and when it did, he met it with humility. Rebirth is not about becoming new, it's about remembering who you've always been.
At some point in every story, the hero stops fighting the world and begins to understand it. After decades of film, fame, and fading, Ralph Macchio had learned something rare, that the measure of a life is not in how bright it burns, but in how kindly it glows. For many actors, reflection comes in crisis. For Ralph, it came in gratitude. He often said, "I never lost myself because I never let fame define me." It sounds simple, but in Hollywood, simplicity is rebellion. He was never trying to be remembered. He was trying to be real. That line, it was never just a piece of dialogue. It was a philosophy. It guided his choices long after the camera stopped. In his work, his marriage, his fatherhood, he became the same man Daniel LaRusso had been taught to be, humble in victory, graceful in defeat, and endlessly curious about what it means to be good. When asked what The Karate Kid truly meant to him, he didn't talk about fame or money or the crane kick. He said, "It was a story about learning respect for yourself and for others." Respect, a word that feels small in Hollywood, yet Ralph carried it like armor. Through decades of shifting trends, he never broke his own moral rhythm. While others tried to reinvent themselves, he simply remained honest, human, whole. He treated every fan encounter like a conversation between equals. He said their stories mattered. And for many, meeting Ralph felt like meeting a memory. The part of themselves that once believed in goodness. That, perhaps, was his quiet superpower. Heroes fade when they are too loud. But those who whisper truth into silence, they live forever. Ralph Macchio became one of those rare souls whose career transformed into something larger than art. It became a reminder that fame is temporary, but integrity is eternal. He knows now that time is the ultimate teacher, that youth was never his greatest role. Wisdom is. He often reflects on Pat Morita, his mentor, his friend, his mirror. When asked what he misses most, he said, "The quiet between takes. The moments when Pat didn't have to say anything, and I still understood him. The greatest teachers speak in silence." And perhaps that's what Ralph has become, a teacher of gentleness, a reminder that strength isn't in how hard you strike, but in how deeply you feel. In an age of chaos, he became a symbol of balance. In a generation that prized irony,
He stood for sincerity. While others traded authenticity for attention, he stayed rooted in truth, a living embodiment of the lesson he once learned on screen. Wax on, wax off. Simple motions, endless meaning. You know, I think I've just been lucky to tell stories that mean something. I never needed to be the biggest, just honest. That honesty became his gift to the world, to be seen not as a legend, but as a man, kind, flawed, enduring. The kind of hero that doesn't vanish when the lights fade, because his light was never borrowed from the spotlight. It came from within. Some stars shine above, others light the path beneath our feet. He's no longer fighting to prove who he is. He's simply living as a husband, a father, a storyteller. And in that simplicity lies something profound. The realization that he has become the very thing his teacher hoped he'd be, not the best fighter, but the best man he could be.
Some stories end with applause. Others end with silence. And in that silence, they live forever. Every artist leaves behind a trail of echoes, moments that outlive their maker, lines that whisper through generations, gestures that never fade. Ralph Macchio's echo is not the loud one of fame, but the soft one of sincerity. It is in the laughter of children who mimic the crane kick, in the eyes of fathers who show the film to their sons, in the countless people who watched The Karate Kid and saw themselves, not as fighters, but as believers. He didn't just play a hero. He reminded the world what a hero looks like when the lights go out. Ralph's legacy is measured not in awards, but in connection. He built bridges across decades, between the innocence of the 1980s and the reflection of the 2020s, between nostalgia and now. And somehow, through all the noise of modern storytelling, his message remained the same: that discipline is sacred, that compassion is strength, and that true victory comes not from defeating others, but from mastering yourself. If people still talk about The Karate Kid in 50 years, I hope it's not because of me, but because of what it stood for. That is how Ralph sees legacy, not as ownership, but as stewardship. He carries the torch not to be admired, but to light the way for those who come after. A legend isn't someone who never fades. It's someone whose light helps others find their own. There are children born long after 1984 who still say, "Wax on, wax off," as if it were a prayer. There are adults who grew up watching Ralph Macchio, who now share his story with their children. A circle unbroken, a light passed hand to hand. That is legacy. That is eternity disguised as memory. Time has taken away the crowds, the frenzy, the youth, but it has given him something far greater: perspective. He sees now that fame was only the surface. The real story was always underneath, in the people whose lives his work touched, in the tears, the smiles, the lessons remembered. What remains after the curtain falls is not applause, but the hearts you helped stay open. He never changed the world through spectacle. He changed it through sincerity. He became proof that in an industry built on illusion, authenticity still wins. That you can live a good life, raise a family, treat people kindly, and still become timeless. When the lights finally dim and the screen fades to black, what endures is the feeling he gave, a quiet belief that decency is not weakness, and that even a small act of kindness can echo longer than fame ever could. Every era has its heroes. Few become symbols of the soul. Ralph Macchio became one, not because he shouted louder, but because he listened deeper. Not because he sought immortality, but because he lived truthfully. And that truth, the courage to remain good in a world that rewards noise, is the eternal flame he leaves behind. Behind every spotlight is a shadow, and within every shadow, a story waiting to be understood. This was his, the story of Ralph Macchio, the boy who became a symbol, the man who chose peace over pride, and the legend who proved that kindness never goes out of style. This is Hollywood Unmasked, where light meets empathy.